Hi everybody, it's Peter Schiff. It is Tuesday, September 7th, 2010. Well, it was a very interesting day in the foreign exchange markets today because the dollar index rose about 1%. I think it closed around 82.80. But the Swiss franc and the Japanese yen each made new 52-week highs against the dollar. Silver also made another 52-week high today. Gold closed up about $8. You generally don't see that when the dollar index is strengthening. And what's really happening here is the dollar is not strengthening. It is weakening. It's weakened against gold. It's weakened against other currencies. It's just that today, other currencies were weaker than the dollar. The euro was weaker than the dollar. And I think the reason for that is because Europe is too easy. They're stimulating too much. Interest rates are too low in Europe. If you look at the economic growth, I think the last quarter, the German economy was growing at an annualized rate of 8%. If Germany were still a standalone country with the Deutschmark, they would be tightening. There's no question that they would be tightening. The reason they're not is because of political pressures from the rest of Europe to be too easy. So the euro is making new record lows against the Swiss franc. It's obviously losing value against gold as well. You saw some weakness in the Canadian dollar and the Australian dollar because of fears that the slowdown in the U.S. is going to slow the global economy. So it was a growth story that hurt those currencies, although I think that's just temporary. I still think that these currencies are going to rise against the dollar. In fact, I think all currencies will rise against the dollar, even the euro, because I think as irresponsible as Europe is being, the U.S. is being even more irresponsible. We are stimulating more. Our monetary policy is even more reckless, and despite the fact that on some days the dollar is less weak than the euro, in general, the dollar will be more weak than the euro, which is why I expect the dollar index to ultimately fall dramatically because of the policies we're pursuing. Part of the problem that we have is the position that the Federal Reserve is in with respect to interest rates and this bond bubble that they have inflated and that so many people still refuse to admit is even a bubble. In fact, my colleague Mike Pinto, who works with me at Europe Pacific Capital, was on CNBC today. I got into a bit of an argument with Erin Burnett. You might want to check that out on YouTube. I think Ms. Burnett was a little out of line. I don't think that Mike was being rude at all, despite her comments. But I really don't think it should be up to Mike or me to try to say why bonds are a bubble. I think it really is on the other side to say why it's not. Because in order to believe that bonds are not a bubble, you have to believe this is a total new era. You have to believe that this time it's different, that interest rates will never again rise to levels that have been average over the past 40 or 50 years. And I think that is the predicament, because so many people now assume that the Fed will never raise rates. And so what happens if inflation picks up? What if the CPI is running at 3 or 4%? What's the Fed going to do? Is the Fed going to raise rates to 5 or 6% to fight the inflation? How could they do that? Then they would prick the bond bubble. There's no way they can do that. So that's the box that we're in, and I think the world is figuring that out, and for good reason. They don't want to own the dollar. At some point, they're not going to want to own these bonds either. The funniest thing about this Pinto story, I'm not making this up, check this out. The guy that he was debating, he tried to argue that bonds were not a bubble, and this was his reasoning. He said, I'm almost going to quote the guy. He said, people are buying bonds, therefore it can't be a bubble when people are buying. I mean, I'm not making this up. I mean, the fact of the matter is, whenever there's a bubble, it's a bubble because people are buying. People buy every bubble. In fact, everybody wants to buy. That's the definition of a bubble. The fact that he's saying that because there are so many buyers that there can't be a bubble, it's absolutely ridiculous. Now, going from the sublime to the ridiculous, let's talk about President Obama's new $50 billion stimulus. Now, if you believe in stimulus, I don't even see how this makes sense. We already had a $700 billion stimulus. If that didn't work, what's an extra $50 billion going to do? Now, of course, the correct argument is we didn't need the stimulus at all. The $700 billion stimulus did a lot of damage, so a $50 billion stimulus is going to do a little bit more damage. Maybe not as much, but it's still going to do more. Now, his idea is, we're going to spend this money on infrastructure. Now, I've explained before, infrastructure spending itself does not help the economy. Now, if it's wise expenditures, if the new infrastructure makes us more productive, if it ultimately means we can produce more consumer goods in the future, then the infrastructure investment is worth it. But when you make the expenditure, it doesn't help the economy. The economy has to suffer the costs of using resources to build infrastructure that might otherwise have been used for something that gives us a more immediate benefit. I mean, they just had an earthquake in New Zealand in Christchurch. You know, people are going to argue, well, this is great for New Zealand because they get to make these infrastructure spending. Well, it's spending that they didn't have to make. They're simply rebuilding what they already had. I mean, wouldn't we be better off if we didn't need any infrastructure spending? Of course. Now, of course, the problem is when the government makes the infrastructure spending, a lot of the infrastructure is built based on political considerations, not economic considerations, so we don't end up getting any long-term benefit despite the short-term costs. You know, on that same argument, you know, Paul Krugman, I don't want to, you know, people to think I'm picking on Krugman, but, you know, I mean, the guy is so consistently wrong. He ran an article yesterday, again, talking about the fact that the economy is probably going to go back into recession. He's got that right. But he's saying it's because we didn't stimulate enough, that it's unfortunate that we don't have a much bigger stimulus like World War II. And he actually wrote that he thinks we got out of the Depression by sheer luck, that it was lucky that the Japanese happened to bomb Pearl Harbor and that we got into World War II because we ended up with this huge stimulus that we never would have gotten peacetime. And so we just got lucky. You know, maybe he thinks if it wasn't for World War II, we'd still be in the Depression. The fact is, we got out of the Depression despite having to fight the Second World War. That wasn't a help. The fact that we had to spend the equivalent of $20 trillion on this war. Look, the benefit of the war was that we defeated the Nazis. We defeated Imperial Japan. It would have been much better off if Hitler never rose to power, if we didn't have to go to World War II, if we didn't have to waste all these resources building bombs. I mean, what Krugman doesn't understand is imagine what we would have done with those resources if we didn't have to fight that war, if it was unnecessary. Sure, he sees the people who got jobs building bombs. What he doesn't see is the things that they would have done if they didn't have to build those bombs. And of course, what Paul Krugman overlooks is the biggest tax increase in U.S. history was in World War II. It was in 1942. It was the victory tax. That was when we had withholding taxes for the first time ever. That was the first time average Americans paid the income tax. The telephone excise tax, that was a victory tax in the Second War, in 1942. And in addition to the biggest tax increase in history, the government borrowed all this money from Americans. Americans bought, you know, war bonds, right? Is Paul Krugman really want American citizens to pour all their money into government bonds? Number one, they don't even have any money. He wants us to keep spending. Does he want a huge tax increase to pay for all this government? No. Where does Paul Krugman want the United States government to get all the money for the massive stimulus? Well, he wants us to borrow it from Japan, borrow it from China. You know, I don't even think he wants us to do that. I think he wants us to print it, right? His prescription to get out of this recession is Soviet-style economics, because that's what the Soviet Union did. They printed up a bunch of rubles, and then the government found ways to spend it. But did the Soviet Union have any economic growth? Despite massive stimulus, they printed trillions and trillions of rubles and spent them, invested them, did all sorts of great things. Did the Soviet Union benefit? No. The people in the Soviet Union didn't benefit until the Soviet Union crumbled, until the thing disintegrated. Now there's some economic growth in what used to be the Soviet Union because the government stopped stimulating. You know, what my fear is that as the economy weakens, we're going to take Krugman's advice. And, you know, maybe the Republicans are going to win in November in these elections. And there are people that are optimistic that we're going to get gridlock if the Republicans take Congress. I'm afraid we're not going to get gridlock. My fear is we get something much worse than gridlock, and that's bipartisanship. And what bipartisanship is when you get the worst Democrat ideas and you combine them with the worst Republican ideas, you put them in one piece of legislation, and then you pass it. Because I think we're going to get more stimulus under Republicans. I think we're going to get a different kind of stimulus. I think we're going to get tax cuts, but we're also going to get spending increases. Because, you know, the Democrats are going to say, well, you know, you can't give away money to the rich and not give more money to the poor. You know, they think if you're taxing somebody 50% and you reduce it to 40%, that the difference that you don't tax is a gift. Of course, because the government thinks that they own everything that we earn and what they let us keep is a gift. But it's not the same, but we're going to get that. And I think we're going to get a much bigger stimulus. We're going to have much bigger deficits. And it's not going to produce the growth that Krugman thinks. It's just going to produce runaway or hyperinflation and a much bigger economic disaster. Anyway, that's it for today, everybody.